Copyright University of Auckland, all rights reserved. The content and delivery of lectures in this course are protected by copyright. Material belonging to others may have been used in these lectures and copied by and solely for the educational purposes of the university under license. You may record the lectures for the purposes of private study or research, but you may not sell, alter, or further reproduce or distribute any part of these lectures to any other person. Failure to comply with the terms of this warning may expose you to legal action for copyright infringement by the copyright owner and/or disciplinary action by the university.
Thank you for coming, really thank you, because we changed the date, we changed the place, we changed everything, and you are here. The weather is terrible, but you are here. So thank you very much for coming tonight, the second lecture of this Communique 2015. And I think will be rewarding, so the effort. And our speaker tonight is Chris Bosse, as you know. And Chris is one of the directors of LAVA, the Laboratory for Visionary Architecture, founded in 2007 together with Tobias Walliser and Alexander Rieck. And this award-winning practice has won numerous international competitions and awards, and its projects are published widely. Amongst other important projects, LAVA designed the city center plan for the CO2 neutral Master City, planned in Abu Dhabi by Foster, as you know. The Michael Schumacher Tower in Abu Dhabi, the future hotel prototype in Duisburg, and a new university master plan in Saudi Arabia. I think that you will kind of give an overview about your work. So behind the success of this firm, as they say, is man, nature, and technology. Indeed, LAVA combines a digital workflow, nature's structural principles, and the latest digital fabrication technologies to achieve more with less, more architecture with less material, energy, time, cost. So back to our speaker. He was educated in Germany and Switzerland. We just found out that we were at a certain time more or less in the same university in Switzerland. And his award-winning design projects have won Bosse an international reputation as a new generation architect who pushes the boundaries of traditional structure and architecture by digital and experimental form finding. Whilst associate architect at PTW in Sydney, Bosse was a key designer of the Beijing Olympic Water Cube. The following year, he received the Emerging Architect RIBA Award, and in 2012, the Perspectives 40 Under 40 for Asia's Rising Design Stars. Alongside his architectural practice, Bosse is adjunct professor at the University of Technology in Sydney and lectures worldwide. Tonight, Chris will share lessons from LAVA's work around the globe, balancing cutting-edge design with sustainability and contemporary client expectation. Please join me in welcoming Chris Bosse. If you want to.
Sure.
Yeah. Let's try with that. Is that all right?
Fantastic. Thank you so much for the introduction. And it was really funny to find out that we spent some time at the same university. I was a student at the time, and you were teaching. And I think it was a couple of years after I left. So that was in Switzerland, in Mendrisio, which is this interesting school. You know, Switzerland has different... So this is an audio test, if you can hear me. Scream if you can't. Switzerland has different regions with different languages and different cultures. So there's an Italian part in Switzerland, there's a French part, there's a German part, and a part that they call Romanche, which is a language that's kind of a mix between all other four languages. But that has nothing to do with this lecture. I will start right now. The lecture is called Digital Cathedrals and the City of the Future. And I want to firstly talk a little bit about LAVA, how we were set up, and about my partners and how we collaborate with other firms. We set up in 2007, which is now, I believe, 7 or even 8 years ago this year. And I was living in Sydney in Australia since 2002, where I had moved pretty much 2 years after I finished university. I had met two guys at the Venice Biennale who come from Germany as well, and we were kind of thinking along similar lines. And so when we started Lava, we set up 3 offices from the beginning. So one in Sydney in Australia, where I live, one in Stuttgart in Germany, where I come from, and the third one was in Abu Dhabi in the United Arab Emirates, where our first project was, which kind of brought us together. And you can see on the world map that there's quite a few time zones going on. And the nice thing about that is that you can actually work around the clock, around the globe. The disadvantage, of course, is that you want to go home at 6 or 7 o'clock and your partner just starts getting up and kind of downloading everything. But it has been a very interesting experience, and being kind of, I mean, you see Sydney here is at the bottom right of the world map, and I think Auckland hasn't made it onto this map, unfortunately. But so we're a little bit remote here. Compared to the rest of the world, but I found that since I came to Sydney, I have traveled a lot more, I have communicated a lot more, and the whole world has changed in a way where you can all of a sudden speak daily to people around the world on Skype, on WeChat, on WhatsApp, and the internet has really brought people together in a completely different way. I was reading a Harry Seidler book the other day when he designed Australia Square, I think in 1971 or something, and he had an Italian engineer, Nervi, at the time. And so he had to draw up all the architectural drawings and then put them in an envelope onto a boat that traveled to Italy for 3 weeks. The Nervi would open the drawings, mark them up, send them back. So you can imagine what kind of information exchange that is compared to today, where you literally do all this in real time. Talking about kind of architects of the past, this is always the architect Frank Lloyd Wright, who saw himself as this God-given architect, you know, the master architect surrounded by his disciples. And it was a very much top-down approach. The master kind of does the master sketch, and everybody else works out what that sketch actually meant. We believe that in the 21st century, when you talk about architecture, but if you talk about design and creativity at large, then we think of that more of a design universe, where the architect is part of this universe and an essential part, and maybe even in the center of the universe, but there's a lot of different other disciplines that are involved with architecture and design and creativity, and the role of the architect then really not becomes doing the master sketch and everybody else just follows the sketch, but the role becomes the coordinator of all these creative disciplines to bring a stellar alignment into the project. So different from a conductor, this is Herbert von Karajan, a famous conductor who was well known for conducting his orchestra down to the last violin, down to every note. Control freak, so to speak. We believe that a contemporary practice is more like a jazz band, where you have experts, and all of you are experts in something or will become experts in something, and you all contribute different parts to a practice and to a project, and everybody has the time to shine as long as you play the same tune, and that's really what's beautiful about jazz. So this is the Lava trio, Tobias, Alexander and myself, in 2008 at the Venice Biennale. This is a more recent picture in 2014. So the Venice Biennale is really a great time every 2 years to reconvene and to reposition ourselves. So we made it for at least 7 years. But this is really what I'm talking about when I'm talking about this kind of network practice. This is me in 2004, I believe, together with some director from PTW Architects, but also with a Chinese design institute called CSCEC, the China State and Construction Engineering Corporation. And it shows you how many different people you can actually collaborate with and how important it is to work with different disciplines. So on any given project, we would work with people like Transolar, who are sustainability consultants, people like Realities United, who specialize in interactive media facades and communication, people like Design Sport, who we just submitted another stadium competition in Doha with. So all these people, you know, architects always think they have to know everything, but we can't possibly know everything. One day we design a hospital, one day a childcare center, and one day a chair. So how do you know everything about all these things? And the key to that is really being open to collaboration, communication, and embrace that design universe. So maybe then a graphic of how these projects and these teams relate would look a little bit like that. Just some pictures from our various offices in Stuttgart, in Berlin, and in this is our Sydney office that we just moved into near Central Park, the new development. I don't know if you've heard of the Jean Nouvel Tower with the green facade that's directly opposite, and the White Rabbit Gallery, contemporary Chinese art gallery. So this is just the inside of our office with a little bit of green in a kind of warehouse-style fit-out. And these are just some shots. This is at a recent project where we took a team photo just to show you it's not necessarily about me or Tobias or Alexander, it's about all these people. And the people actually constantly change. I haven't got the exact figures, but over the last 8 years we would have had hundreds of different people. This is an important photo for me. This is, I call this our Chinese office. But you can see it's actually the car of our client, and it's the kind of car you know, that has a sofa and a lounge. I'm surprised that it doesn't have a spa. But China is so big that setting up an office in China is like saying, I set up an office in Europe. So do you put it to Sweden or to Sicily? China is so vast in terms of the different regions, the different languages, the different cultures, the different climates, that we in China are incredibly mobile, and we have to be mobile. And China has become a very important part of our practice and of, I think, everybody's practice. And just to put that in perspective, I always talk about the numbers. I don't even know, and I apologize, how many inhabitants New Zealand has, but Australia has 22 million, I think, and China has 1.4 billion. So enter China minus enter Australia, still 1.38 billion. So it's almost no difference. And that tells you, in terms of a size of a market or impact on the world, in terms of building infrastructure, in terms of energy, in terms of you know, producing produce, etc. All of a sudden, Australia and New Zealand are in a critical geographical location, and I think culturally we're part of Asia Pacific, and that becomes more and more evident. And I've just arrived in Auckland, so I haven't really soaked that all in, but in Sydney, certainly over the last 10 years, it has become a lot more Asian than it used to be. It used to be this kind of Anglo-Saxon city, which is, of course, to do with the history. But Sydney is really part of Asia, and I would dare to say that New Zealand is as well. We love building models, and we love working on different platforms. So we build physical models, we work with computers, we use 3D printers. You probably have a few of those here. So 10 years ago, this was an emerging technology. 5 years ago, these machines cost $20,000. Today, you can buy one, I think, for $500. And it's interesting how that changes the world and changes not only architecture, but everything from art to medicine. So this is a 3D print, for example, of a kind of undefined object, which could be anything from a piece of jewelry to a piece of furniture to a contemporary piece of architecture, a concert hall or something. When we talk about inspiration, then we like to talk about this relationship between nature, technology, and humankind. And our relationship with nature is that nature obviously has developed over millions of years, and the principles of nature haven't actually changed. Technology, however, changes on such a incremental speed that we all know, the telephone that you carry around with yourself contains a computer that 20 years ago wouldn't even have been invented, and 10 years ago would have been only one on the planet owned by NASA. So it's unbelievable what technologies have been developed over the last years, and people say that in the next 10, 20 years, all inventions of the world so far will have been reinvented again. So the number of inventions is exponential. So I think that nature is the element that balances us and that keeps us really connected to the land, to geography, to sun, to water, to energy. And I think that technology is something that, because it constantly changes, we need to build buildings that constantly adapt and change and integrate these technologies. And humankind, of course, being our client mostly, or what we all design for, is trying to balance these two aspects. So there are people who say, let's go back to nature, I don't want any of this new technology, and try to kind of separate themselves from everything that is new. That is kind of one trend, but I think it's a very short-lived kind of nostalgic trend. Other people are completely immersed in technology and completely deny the existence of nature and natural environments, but that is also very single-sided. And we believe if we can really bring these two things together into a new kind of hybrid form of architecture, of design, and all other aspects of life, then that really expresses the world that we live in. This is my favorite building of all times. It's designed in 1972 by architect engineer Fry Otto. And if you haven't heard of Fry Otto, he actually received the Pritzker Award last week, 2 days after he passed away, unfortunately, but at the age of 90, I believe. And Fry Otto, what's amazing about this building is this was built in 1972, and Fry Otto coined the terminology of form finding as opposed to designing. So he would say, I don't design the finished product, but I design the process to find the finished product. And that would again involve all sorts of different collaborators, but collaborators also that are design models, that are soap bubbles, for example. So he would do a lot of experiments with nature and in nature and try to translate things from nature into architecture, into engineering. And hence the result here is a building that doesn't even look like a building. It looks like a landscape. It's kind of a cloud roof that hovers over a topography. And I find it incredibly contemporary when you think that it's 43 years old. So learning from nature and learning from patterns in nature, from organization in nature, there's really unlimited inspiration. When you look at the rainforest, all the different strata levels, different species, how they all coexist with each other. And when you look at things like the Great Barrier Reef, that is really the biggest living organism on the planet and visible from space. So we like to think that these are kind of metaphors for today's cities and ways of we could today organize ourselves. And within these ecosystems you find creatures, and of course these creatures are perfectly adapted to the environment as well. And it's really amazing when you look into that in greater detail, what kind of geometries you find, what kind of colors you find. And when you look into what these geometries do, where they come from, where the colors come from, then you find that they're really the ability of adaptation over millions of years to an environment. And buildings are pretty much still straight boxes. When you look at technologies that come from other disciplines, technologies, this is a toy, this dog, and even the dog is like 10, 15 years old now. The idea of building a robot dog that kind of responds to you, that gets the newspaper in the morning for you, that barks at strangers, and that kind of reacts to your emotions. That's amazing that someone would develop a toy like that. And at the same time, biology, medicine, nanotechnology, there's all these things that are incredibly developed, and much more sophisticated than contemporary architecture. Contemporary architecture seems to be stuck in modernism. And so modernism was one of the greatest high-rise towers in the world, built in New York in the 60s, which was based on inventions like the curtain wall facade, the air condition, and the elevator. But at the end of the day, it's an extruded box with an applied facade. So it's hermetically sealed, and there's no transition between inside and outside. So when you're inside that building, you have no idea what the weather is, because the facade is body-tinted glass, the temperature is constant, humidity is constant, and you have absolutely no contact between inside and outside. You have to constantly air condition, you have to constantly electrically light the building. And so in a way, as fantastic as this invention is, it's kind of the opposite of what we would consider like a natural kind of way of living. And when you look at the human skin or the plant skin or the animal skin, then it's all about this transition between inside, outside, adaptation to humidity, temperature, air pressure, etc. Essentially mediating external and internal forces. And if architecture could get around these kind of ideas where you use technology to emulate principles from nature, then I believe we would result in a smarter, more environmentally friendly and more pleasant environment. And taking this from the building skin to structure, investigations, and that's the kind of stuff that Frei Otto would do, investigating in nature, how nature builds structures. And as you would appreciate, there's not many straight lines in nature. So why are most buildings and most engineering kind of systems based on straight lines? Systems, what I call systems here, kind of evolutionary systems. When you look at a school of fish, thousands of fish that are all working together as a school, and they're all reacting to the external forces, but they're still individuals. Why can't we develop building components that are smart building components, that the overall building is not just a pile of bricks, which are all like relatively simple and dumb elements, but a holistic system where all the elements talk to each other and all contribute to each other. The brick, essentially, is the same brick that the pyramids were built with thousands of years ago, that we now build our houses in the suburbs with. And we believe there's potential for bricks to collect water, to produce energy, to mediate humidity, etc., and so on and so forth. New materials usually don't come from the building industry, they come from other industries. They come from the space industry, they come from the car industry, and only slowly trickle into architecture. But when they actually do, then they can be breakthroughs. And one example is, for example, I don't know if I can laser point with this material here, which is the ETFE material that we used for the Aquatic Center in Beijing, which I will use as an example later. So having said all this, I want to show you this as a little showcase. This project was designed and built during my time at PDW Architects in Sydney. I spent my first 5 years in Australia there, from 2002 to 2007. And when I started, we started the competition pretty much after a couple of months. And I had just come from Stuttgart, where Frei Otto was teaching, the Institute of Lightweight Structures, and we were all about structures in nature, soap bubbles, foam, coral reefs, etc. And so that was one of the ideas that I could bring to the project, and which became ultimately the competition-winning idea. This is just a quick master plan to position. If you've been to Beijing, so you know there's the Forbidden City in the center of Beijing, and then there's a central axis that goes all the way up to the Olympic Park. This was the Aquatic Center in the competition brief, and this was the National Stadium in the competition brief, now known as the Bird Nest. And we settled during the competition on this idea of circle and square, which is a very Chinese kind of interpretation, where you kind of try to balance contrasts. So circle and square, red and blue, fire and water, yin and yang, those kind of elements. And I will only show this briefly here. I could talk about this forever. But having settled on a blue square, we looked at the internet essentially. So, 20 years ago, you would have gone to the regional library, looked at a couple of books, maybe see if you can order a few more books in. But today, it's kind of 30 seconds, and you have these kind of results if you type in bubbles. So we looked at nature, and together with our engineering company, Arup, found that there's these geometries that are actually hidden between the arrangement of soap bubbles. So we wanted to build a box of bubbles. And what I didn't know in that detail, but what we found out is that physicists from around the world for hundreds of years have investigated this geometry of foam. It's not something that you get up every morning and think, today I resolved the physics of foam. But Lord Kelvin, for example, did in 1873 come up with a certain system. And 120 years later, people from Ireland came up with another foam model, which is this one here, so-called weir-phelan foam. And so the idea behind this is that if you try to subdivide three-dimensional space into equally sized geometrical elements, then you ultimately come up with two different polygons, a 12-sided polygon and a 14-sided polygon that you can tile infinitely in space, and it doesn't leave any gaps in between. Sounds very complicated, but is actually very simple. If you fill a box with tennis balls, then they will all sit there nice and tight, but between the tennis balls you have gaps. And engineers hate gaps because it's space that you can't define. With this foam model, you fill all the gaps, and all of a sudden you have a mathematical model, a theoretical model of foam. And so this was our first 3D print of this theoretical foam. And while this looks like something that you would find somewhere on the beach in Auckland, it's in fact 100% man-made, 3D printed, 100% repetitive mathematical structure. And so when Frei Otto in the 70s did these kind of experiments, he did it manually, and he found that when you try to build foam in 3 dimensions, that there's a lot of deviations between the different foam molecules. So after 10 or 15 or 20 molecules, the calculation becomes so complicated and the physical model becomes so distorted that it becomes uncontrollable. In 2002 or 2003, when we did this competition, now with computation, we found that we can build infinite amounts of this theoretical foam. We can put it into an Excel spreadsheet. We can develop 3-dimensional models. And this can actually then become the mother model for everybody involved in the project. So it becomes like a virtual prototype for structure, for the steel manufacturer, for the hydraulic engineer, for the downpipes, the amount of rainwater, for fire security, etc., etc. And that is really something that the last 2 decades have brought to us, or even just the last decade. Interesting, of course, when you're building in China, that China has had an extremely steep learning curve over the last 10 years. But in 2003, we have this amazing, sophisticated 3D virtual reality model. But the reality is on the construction side, there's people with a piece of steel and a sphere and a stick and welded together by hand. So that was a very interesting period to translate the 3D model and the 3D printed model into reality with the help of essentially pre-cut steel elements that came onto the construction site, all labeled and all positioned and all cut to size, and then 400 people that got trained on site to weld these things together. And I was surprised sometimes to find these manually written notes, as if someone in 22,000 elements can just write down the number of the steel elements. But magically, and this is obviously kind of cutting a long story short, we built this structure that is made of 22,000 elements, a structure that is 180 meters long and 35 meters high, that is based on this weir-phelan foam from the 2 Irish professors, and that is now recognized as the most efficient three-dimensional subdivision of space following this theoretical model. And what you find is that the structure is actually extremely light and extremely transparent, in particular when you look at it through the structure at the bird nest in the background. So these two things were really shaping up at the same time as these very stark contrasts. One kind of very heavy and very kind of dominant, and one kind of very filigrane and very light. This steel structure is then wrapped into a plastic skin. And I say plastic skin, it's obviously a very sophisticated high-tech material that was developed by NASA for space application. And what it is, it's a plastic film that can be inflated, and by inflation it assumes structural properties. And you can build shapes or panels of up to 9 meters of this material. So you can imagine this entire lecture hall would have one single panel as a roof, which is transparent, inflated, 0.1 millimeter thick plastic. And that created essentially a kind of winter garden effect, a cavity between two layers of this material. And within this cavity, the air can be heated or cooled by the sun, naturally heated, artificially heated, and that energy can be used then to heat or cool the internal space. And this is one of these panels. This is a mock-up in 1:2, just to give you an idea of dimensions. And so piece by piece, these elements went onto the facade, and it's worthwhile pointing out here that this is one complete set of geometries that were used, and then the geometries repeat. So it's not 6,000 different bubbles on the facade, it's 16, I think, different bubbles on the facade. And because the 3D model is a repetitive model, we called it an apparently random but repetitive model. They repeat, they rotate and mirror, but you can essentially prefabricate them and then build them up rapidly outside. In 2004, I believe, we won the Venice Biennale award for this project, which was quite surprising because it wasn't even built yet. But when it was built in 2007, 1 year ahead of schedule, you could really see how all these ideas of structure from nature, lightweight, a lot of light and a lot of air in the building came through in reality. And a couple of spaces within the building are really my favorite spaces. And that's maybe where this cathedral, the digital cathedral, comes from, because the cathedrals were always this space where humankind really pushed the boundaries of what is possible to construct and kind of express their time in a built form of, art, architecture excellence, engineering excellence. And what you really see here is something that is 100% structure, but it's also 100% architecture. And the facade and the structure and the architecture all becomes one and the same thing. So there's no decoration in this building. There's nothing that is added just because it looks good. There's nothing that you can take away. Everything is integral part of it. And that gives you really this contemporary and kind of cathedral-esque expression. And what we do as architects is kind of trying to express the time that we live in and try to be as contemporary as we can be. So I'm always getting upset when councils, for example, ask us to design Art Deco buildings in Bondi Beach, because Art Deco is obviously a style from 1920s, which was fantastic at the time, the latest craftsmanship, latest materiality, latest everything, but it was 100 years ago. So if you do if someone asks you to do an Art Deco building, then try to apply the principles from 100 years ago and make it look like it is actually 2015. The Olympics came and the buildings were finished and very popular with the public, very popular with the athletes as well. When if you watch the Olympics, I think in the pool every single world record in swimming was broken that year. And obviously that's not because of the building alone, but I think if you're an athlete and entering a space like that, this is taken from the 10-meter diving board, and you're kind of standing in front of this, then you feel like it's 2008 and you want to break the world record. And so I hope that the building kind of keeps its freshness, and it's still standing now, which is 7 years later. Time flies, it's crazy. But the building is still very well used. This was the perspective from 2003 from the competition, and this is the finished building. And I'm just showing these two because in the competition, obviously, we didn't want to show something which is just kind of a concept that never works, but we really had a virtual prototype where everything was worked out to a degree that it was 100% buildable, and that's why we had to change very little during the construction process. And also because you can't actually change anything. So every time someone said, oh, we have to put a pitched roof on it, or we have to simplify the facade, there's nothing that you can simplify or change because everything is perfect as it is. At night, it lights up like a lantern with LED lights. The individual bubbles are illuminated. And that's probably one of the reasons of its popularity as well, because at night it really, this is a bad photo, but it really kind of shines like when you go through an Asian city, it's all about lighting and about this interactivity. Since then, the building has become a bit of a celebrity, and it's almost embarrassing sometimes, but there's these books, it's been on the cover of Architecture Now, and now there's these merchandise shops, and I'm just going to flick through them quickly. So you can be completely dressed in water cube outfits, from t-shirts to shawls to beanies to jumpers. You can buy a Swarovski special edition. You can buy a water cube telephone. I haven't worked out yet how to dial on this, but certainly looks good. There's artists inspired. There's swimwear, and there's this swimwear, I don't know if it's swimwear design competition or something here at the Water Cube. And so the building is used for all sorts of things like that. I don't know if you had the pleasure of drinking rice wine by Ju. So there's a special bottle of the Water Cube filled with 2008 by Ju, which is kind of a very popular Chinese drink. And the bed sheets, and so you can imagine my home. And watches, bathroom tiles. And just maybe worthwhile pointing out, we of course didn't receive a single cent from all this. And then there were buildings popping up inspired by the Water Cube, restaurants and cafes. This is a day spa, I think, in Chongqing. And then someone sent me this photo of this casino in Macau, where they thought, why don't we just copy the entire building? So this is literally a complete copy of the Water Cube in Macau. I haven't been there myself, but it's a little bit beyond me, but it's kind of a compliment because, the pyramids have made it into a casino. The Eiffel Tower, I think entire Venice is kind of a casino in Las Vegas, so why not the Water Cube? The real Water Cube, in the meantime, has turned into a public swimming pool, into a leisure pool. So you can now buy a ticket for, I think, 50 RMB and take your family into the wave pool and down the rides and all these funny things. This was designed before the Olympics for the post-Olympic condition. And we had some design involvement, but you can kind of see that the leisure park designers kind of took it on themselves. But I think it's a fun experience. And since then, there's things like the World Formula One Championship around Bird Nest and Water Cube. And now there's a lighting artist who programs the Water Cube, and somehow you can send interactive messages to the building and then changes color according to the mood of the people around it. The building has apparently become the second biggest tourist attraction after the Great Wall, which I personally find hard to believe, but that's what people say. You know, every Chinese, there's a Chinese saying, which I can't say in Chinese, but it says that every man has to climb on the Great Wall in his life. And so now, apparently, while you do that, you might as well visit the Olympic site. And so the other day, I don't know if you watched that on television, that's the APEC conference. So you had Putin and Obama and this guy, don't know if you know him. They were all at the water cube, and they were all funnily dressed in these amazing outfits. And so in the media, that was widespread. So they anticipated the APEC conference by about 50 years back then. And this is probably where they all stayed. This is the hotel next to the water cube, where you can have a room with view on the water cube roof. And you can actually see that even the roof has bubbles. And you can't imagine the amount of conversations we had about that, because everybody, you know, in the construction process says, oh, we just put corrugated metal on it. But then it turned out that everything else that you wanted to put on there was too heavy, because it was designed for lightweight ETFE, which weighs 1% of the weight of glass. So you couldn't replace it with anything else. And yeah, so there's lots of stories about how that actually works with siphonic drainage. You can imagine trying to get water off a 180 by 180 meter surface, and ventilation. So these things popped out for ventilation where the cores are. But at the end of the day, the whole thing was wrapped in one single plastic skin and survived till now, and lights up at night, even the roof. Yeah, this is the last picture of this building. This is Michael Phelps breaking the world record, and what was amazing that they had cameras actually underwater, so you could kind of follow the swimmers in the pool and looking at the water cube roof. And the only people apparently who didn't like it was the backstroke swimmers, because they're used to swim along straight lines, and in the water cube they didn't know where to swim anymore. So that was the water cube, and obviously people always asked me back then, you know, what are you going to do, you know, building the Olympic swimming pool for the Beijing Olympics, the greatest pool for the greatest nation, what do you do afterwards? So no pressure. But we've been working since then, so since 2008, on a large amount of projects around the world. And I'm just going to show a couple of them, just for you to get an idea of the type of projects that we're doing. This, for example, is a hotel resort in Mexico, which is kind of on a floating island. And this is a project for the German government, the Green Climate Fund headquarters. If you've been to Germany, generally government buildings look a little bit like that. And so now it's very brave of the German government to take on a design like this to represent Germany in 2015 as opposed to 1960. And so it's a new kind of topology for an office building that lets a lot of light and air into the building, that is based on communication and on accidentally meeting people in the staircase. You know, a traditional German office building, you get into the lift, go to your floor, go out, hope that nobody sees you and go into your office and then come out at 5:30. But this building forces you to move your body, go up and down, talk to people, see light, see air, have contact with nature, and it's immersed in a park. So it's going to be an exciting new experience. And this is a little video, if it works, of this building, and that gives me a 30-second break to have a sip of water. There's probably sound attached to it, but it doesn't matter. This is actually an amazing, I'm always surprised. This is a professional rendering company. And it's amazing what they can do with the information that you provide them. So this is like a Hollywood movie based on one of our 3D Studio Max models. I'm sure you can do that better. So the times where you could win a competition with a couple of hand sketches, like Jörn Utzon apparently, with the Opera House. And following on from that is another project in Jeju Island in Korea, a large-scale hotel that is kind of formed like a volcano because the entire island is volcanic. And we thought that the only way to put such a big development onto such a small island is literally making it part of the island and of the topography. But I'm just going to skip through these quickly. This is a project in Ethiopia in Northeast Africa, and another competition that we won. And obviously we don't win every competition, in the opposite. There's probably a 99-to-1 kind of success rate, or a 1-to-99 success rate. But the ones that we do win, we usually have put a lot of effort in. And usually I find that the competitions that we win internationally are the ones where we really try to understand the task at hand and try to understand the culture that we're actually designing for and the economic and environmental and so on framework, rather than just transplanting some previously designed thing onto a site. And so this being in North Africa, and in Ethiopia, it's obviously a relatively emerging country, relatively poor country, but it has its own kind of art and culture and artifacts and colors and economy and topography, geography. And we wanted to build a very low-cost stadium. And so the idea is that if you sink the grandstand into the ground, then you already have a natural stadium, which is actually a very old idea because the ancient Greek and Roman stadia were built like that. So this is the first kind of rank. And then all you have to build is the upper tiers to get your stadium. And then you wrap it into a lightweight skin. And if you have money, then you put a roof to cover the seats from the environment. That was the first strategy, which I think was positively received. And the second strategy was that most of the competitors put one big stadium type bird nest in the center of the site and said, okay, that's it, don't worry about the rest. We try to understand what this part of the city actually means and try to incorporate existing sporting facilities, a sports academy and existing kind of athletic track, and try to kind of weave a sports precinct into the city that includes a sports hotel, training facilities, public swimming pools, tennis courts, etc., in a way that you actually create a park that is not only a stadium that is active when there's a match on, but a park that is really a gift to the city. And the facade is kind of a lightweight skin that reflects the national colors, and that could be, while it's designed with contemporary technologies, with Rhino and Grasshopper and scripting, it could be actually built out of local fibers and local kind of weaving strategies by local craftspeople relatively economically. And that somehow resonated with the local people and with the local jury. And out of I don't know how many entries, we won the first prize. This is now 2 years ago, and nothing is easy, and building a stadium in Africa is certainly not easy. There's a lot of political difficulties. There's the president, who was the client originally, subsequently passed away after the competition, which didn't help. And now there's all sorts of political forces trying to bring another stadium in instead of this, but it's a project that is very close to our heart. And Gregor just walked in. They have a number of projects in Ethiopia, which you would have seen last week if you were here. Same time, same place. It's certainly interesting working in Africa, and it's certainly completely different from working in kind of Germany and Australia. So just in the quick projects that I want to flick through, this was the Michael Schumacher Tower that was mentioned before. This was one of our first projects. This is what I call a pre-crisis project. 2007, Dubai was going berserk with new projects left, right, center, and architecture was almost becoming a branding exercise. You know, how can you name the next tower and how can you make it different from the other 500 towers that are exactly on the same location? And so Michael Schumacher, the Formula One driver at the time, was approached by a marketing company to launch a Michael Schumacher World Championship Tower as a brand. And so we had the interesting task to translate all these brand values of Michael Schumacher, which is like speed, elegance, high tech, and so on, into a residential tower. And then Michael Schumacher came to the press conference, and kind of 5 minutes before the presentation, it's like, okay, so tell me something about this building. So we had to, and then we kind of tried to summarize it. Yeah, and there's penthouses, and you have a 360-degree view. And so, how many degrees? Was a bit like that. But essentially the tower was a tower standing in a marina. So the idea was that you can park your boat inside the tower, and then it has this continuous curvature, like sculpture, where every floor plan is actually different, and on top you have these penthouses, and in between you have these ventilation slots and balconies. This is where you know, if you have everything in the world, then you need a speedboat, and then you need an apartment where you can park your speedboat. And the reason why I call it pre-crisis tower is probably quite obvious. This was in 2008. The tower was launched at the Dubai Cityscape exhibition along with 400 other towers on this island. And about 6 months later, the crisis hit, and none of these towers went anywhere, and the project was put to bed. To rest, I should say. I talked about Fry Otto earlier and about this idea of form finding, and this is actually one of Fry Otto's experiments, where you dip two wires into soap film, and you pull up the wires, and the surface that would be formed between the wires is referred to as a minimal surface. So it's kind of a mathematical equation, but you can do it very playfully, and everybody has played with soap bubbles before. But it's interesting that in such playful manner you would find something that is stronger, more efficient, and lighter than anything that you would have designed yourself. And a lot of architects are struggling with this idea where you try to design something that is super cool, and then you try to build it, but you haven't thought about what is the material, how does the structure work, how does it keep the water out, and how do all these things work together. And this is kind of thinking the other way around, where you think, with this material, what can I actually do, and how can I find a form that this material wants to be in? And so the photo was from 1972, and these are some projects that we kind of did in the last 10 years, where we tried to use this idea of minimal surface computationally, develop shapes in the computer, run scripts over them to find the ideal shape. So what we design is not the shape, we design the connection points. We feed the computer with these connection points, and then the shape is the mathematical equation of the minimal surface. And this is all done with a lightweight material. So this entire structure, for example, fits into a sports bag and can be carried around, and you can build it up overnight in any location. And what's really nice about this is that, you know, if you try to build this shape out of any other material, out of concrete, out of timber, out of metal, you would try and force these materials into the shape, and with fabric it naturally flows into it. This was the MTV Awards stage design with pink, hence it was pink. And this is a little project in Customs House in Sydney, which is a heritage building, and we were commissioned to transform the atrium of the heritage building, but we weren't allowed to touch it. So we designed again these connection points, and the connection points are aluminium rings that are attached with fishing lines around these heritage columns, so the actual structure doesn't touch. And if this works, then you see a little video of how the structure then overnight climbed up in the atrium. And everything that goes up has to come down after 6 months. But you can see how the material literally fits into this bag. And and I can't remember now how many cubic meters of space that was, but to fill an entire atrium with something that fits into a bag and can be carried away is really a nice thought, and maybe exemplifies what you were talking about earlier with this more with less idea. And so we're trying to translate this idea of lightweight membranes and membrane technologies into architecture. And in Sydney, there's this wonderful building from the 60s, the UTS Tower. And I'm sure in Auckland you have a couple of those as well. The problem is that, and I was speaking about 1960s buildings before, the problem is that at the time they were completely high-tech, novel, invention of the lift, invention of air conditioning, invention of the curtain wall facade, invention of body tinted glass, electric light, all these things that are fantastic, but they're not contemporary necessarily anymore. And buildings are very static elements, and it's very hard to make them future open. And so we were thinking, instead of now demolishing a tower like this, with all the embedded energy, the cost, the disruption of teaching within UTS Tower, would there be a way of actually transforming the tower by adding extra layers to it? And so the idea was adding an extra skin and make that skin the most intelligent skin that a building today can be. Lightweight membrane that can collect solar energy, collect rainwater, can at night communicate to the outside world. And what tower would be a better project than the university tower, where you have all these different disciplines, where you have fashion design, lighting design, engineering, climate engineering, structure, architecture. And so we pretty much did this to entertain ourselves at the time. And I shouldn't say it like that. We did it more as a research project than as a paid commission. But research is entertaining, and interestingly, it kind of caught on, and a lot of people were interested in it. So all of a sudden, we had engineers coming to our office and say, "Hey, so I thought about your tower, and you could really use it for natural ventilation, and you could switch off the aircon, and we could make all these windows clear glass, and actually then you can start opening them up, and then you get an updraft here." And so all of a sudden, you would transform the building not only aesthetically, but you would completely climatically transform it. And all of a sudden, a building would have a 21st century layer, a layer that can change over time, but is still extremely lightweight and extremely cost effective. We built a little model for an exhibition at an object gallery in Sydney. And then we got a phone call from Rio de Janeiro that we had won the Reskinning Award 2010, which we never had heard of before. But it's really interesting that there are awards like this, because the entire world is thinking about, the future of the city, and the future of the city is related to the past of the city. What do you do with all these buildings? Do you just knock down every city every 20 years? Or are there ways of actually transforming cities in the future? And so, inspired by that success, we then built a prototype even bigger. This is in 1:3 prototype of a high-rise tower, which was built at the DesignX exhibition in Sydney. So we got sponsors for the steel, sponsors for the facade material, and sponsors for the lighting. And while this is not 100% perfect, it gives you an idea of what you can actually achieve with lightweight materials on real scale in real environments. And so far we haven't pulled off this tower yet, but the idea is certainly there, and we're certainly interested in taking that to the next level. Another little story, we got approached 2 years ago by these two people who wanted to set up a creative writing center in Redfern, Sydney. So they're two ex-journalists, and they thought, why don't we teach our skills of writing stories to children? So they rented a space which was a pretty rundown space. I don't know if you know Redfern in Sydney. It's not the best part of town, but it's kind of emerging. And they commissioned a creative agency to come up with the concept that the Creative Writing Center is about creativity and not a school. So the creative agency came up with this idea that we could call it the Martian Embassy. So you have an ambassador, and you get your passport stamped on your journey to Mars. And so when the kids come in, they start kind of talking about interesting stories rather than talking about being in school. So that was the brief to us. Brief was create a Martian embassy, create a shop where you can sell merchandise to finance the endeavor, and create a school to actually teach. We then kind of intuitively merged these three things, as you do, into one, prioritizing the school, and then came up with all kind of ideas of rockets and all the big novels of our times that have inspired us since childhood, Moby Dick, Time Machine. And then we came up with this very simple concept that is actually so simple that you can draw it, into sand on the beach. That there's these three spaces, they're connected into one continuous space, and then they're sliced like an MRI scan, essentially. That could be easily translated into a 3D model, into a physical model, and it could be built out of one single material. So this is a physical model, and the physical model is built from the same 3D model that the final building or the final interior was built from, which is plywood as a material. And as you can see, all surfaces, the wall, the ceiling, the furniture, and the shelf, storage, reception desk, everything was made out of the same material. And so the 3D model was essentially unwrapped onto drawing sheets, onto CNC cutting sheets that were sent to a CNC cutter. This is the first prototype with our builder here in 1:1. And in the meantime, the Story Factory, the clients, made this little movie for fundraising. And so the little movie is about an Aboriginal kid that probably doesn't have the greatest future on the path that it's currently traveling on. And what would happen if you actually unleash the kind of hidden forces within this kid, which is creativity? What if you tap into that creativity, teach him a few things, and then could propel that kid into a completely different future, which is really what they're trying to do with the Martian Embassy. That video clip featured these two, Julia Gillard and Tony Abbott, and then the media story was that the Martian Embassy is the only thing they ever agreed on, which was good, and helped the client to raise funds from all these people. So this whole thing is a charity. So the engineers, the architects, the builder, even the plywood supplier, everything was donated. Our time was donated. Everybody else's time was donated. And for the few things that we had to pay for, these people paid for it. And so one day, the big day came. The 1,024 pieces of plywood came numbered into the space. It would have been a better idea if they didn't come all at once, but we kind of thought about that afterwards. So we had all these pieces, like a big IKEA kind of shelf to assemble. And then within the next kind of 6 weeks, they were all assembled one by one into one gigantic kind of inside of a whale spaceship Moby Dick. And when the first kids arrived, these are the kids, the children of the builder, they started kind of immediately climbing all over the space and, hey, what is this? I have no idea, but let's check it out. And that really showed us how the concept works, where it's not a square box, it's not a school, you don't know what you're supposed to do because you're actually not supposed to do anything. You're supposed to think about what this could be, and then you start writing it down. So the building got opened, the sign was changed to the Martian Embassy, was opened by Marie Bashir. And these are some photos, some professional photos we took after the opening. So you can see how this all, the continuous space works. The only thing that is not out of plywood was this furniture. And that is because when you design for children, once you tap into, it's better not to even mention that, but once you tap into all the regulations, what could happen if children fall off the furniture, then you start buying furniture that exists. But essentially, the entire space otherwise is made out of the same material. All these desks and kind of storage units and shelves and so on. And the creative agency designed all these little funny things. You can buy these cans. They contain things like gravity, Martian invasion kits. You can look at paraphernalia from the Mars exploration. You can buy a map to Mars, the really lonely planet guide. You can start your own crop circles and so on. And this is kind of the 360-degree view of the space, which really summarizes the space best, because that's kind of what it makes you feel spinning around. We won the Premier's Award at the AIA Institute, which was very nice. I have the funny feeling that the award was more for the fact that it was a charity and children and so on. But obviously they also liked how the brief was transformed creatively. And there's a book that you can buy that further kind of sponsors the Sydney Story Factory in Redfern. Okay, what's this? This is, I go through this quickly, just as an introduction to the next project. The idea behind this is that in history, with every new invention, there's always a breakthrough, obviously, in technology, and that always has an expression in architecture. So when you think about, when steel became commercially available and you could build three-dimensional structures, the Eiffel Tower was built, then the Empire State Building with electricity, with the curtain wall, not the curtain wall facade a little bit later, but with the lift, the Weissenhof Siedlung, concrete, steel beams, the Seagram Building with the curtain wall facade. And then in the 90s, all of a sudden this time came with the Guggenheim of Bilbao, where all of a sudden everything was possible, seemingly possible, and all of a sudden you think you can build any shape that you like, and you have to build anything you can. And so the question for us was, where would this all lead to, and what is actually the time that we're living in? And this project Master that I want to introduce next is this kind of project that talks about sustainability and about health and about organization of the city of the future rather than individual buildings. So the master plan for the city is by Norman Foster, and it's an initiative by the UAE government in Abu Dhabi to create essentially a living laboratory, a piece of city that is 1.5 by 1.5 kilometers in size, and where you really research how can urbanism be zero carbon, zero waste, car-free, and how can be an entire city built on sustainable principles that kind of leave everything else behind. A lot of people said, oh yeah, it's kind of easy, you build a laboratory in the desert, they have all the money. Why can't you do it with the real city? And that is true, but I also think that the whole point of a laboratory is to have confined conditions, because then you can actually experiment and you can measure the results. So building something that is completely separate from everything else and test new public transport systems, new energy generation systems, new types of spaces, etc., is really an exciting procedure. And to do that in the Middle East is interesting, because obviously they're funded by oil, but they're thinking about the time post-oil, a post-oil society, and what that could mean for them. And so the entire city is kind of run by sustainable renewable energies, but interestingly it's also based on very sound principles of urbanism, which are again these kind of century-old principles of material, of self-shading, of how to orientate a city to get the breeze and wind directions, etc., etc. And so only then you add latest technology. So it comes back to what I was saying earlier, maybe about this relationship with nature and technology, that technology constantly changes, and it's almost impossible to catch the latest technology, because as soon as you implement it, it will already be last year's. But the principles of nature are the principles that are prevailing throughout the centuries. And so here's some kind of gadgets. This is a new transportation system, a magnetic electric car that works like you have this in high-rise towers these days with destination control, where you have 50 people waiting for the lifts. The lift knows where you want to go, and it calculates what's the quickest lift to come to you to bring this amount of people to these different floors. So on a horizontal level, you want to go to the cinema, someone else wants to go shopping, the third person wants to leave the city, and these pods come to you based on what the minimal distance is and the least amount of energy to bring all these people to their destination, as opposed to what we have here and in Germany, 2 cars per household, and everybody drives to where they want to drive to. And if we translate that to China, as we said earlier, if 1.4 billion people have 2 4-wheel drives and a double garage, then that will cause certain challenges. But what do we have to do with it? Lava was invited to design in a competition the center of the city. And so when we looked at the brief for the competition, there was really no real center defined in the city. And Norman Foster had allocated this egg-shaped building in the center as a conference center. We kind of identified, our idea, I guess, was that the center of the city doesn't have to be a building. It doesn't need an egg-shaped conference center in the center. What it actually needs is a public space. So we kind of split the egg into individual buildings, pushed these buildings to the side, and created public space. And while that sounds very simple, it's kind of a novel concept for Abu Dhabi. So we looked at things like the Piazza San Marco, and if you've been to Venice, wherever you go in Venice, you will always end up on Piazza San Marco. And so in a similar way, wherever you go in Masdar City, you will always end up in Masdar Plaza. And the buildings that surround the plaza become kind of background. There's still important buildings. There's a hotel, there's still the conference center, there's a cinema complex, this is a retail complex, and this is the Masdar headquarters. But at the end of the day, the buildings do their own thing, and they build a backdrop for a public space, which is really where public activity can happen. And in the Middle East, you have this problem, of course, that it's very hot, and you have to shade. And so we looked at nature for inspiration and found this idea of sunflowers that act as umbrellas that literally shade by opening and closing the space. So during the day, they cover the plaza, and at night they fold up and turn into a lighting field, and all of a sudden become like an interactive element. So it's kind of an adaptive space, while most of the other competitors created these big indoor structures. KPF, for example, came second with big glass structures. And you know, if you've been to the Middle East, essentially what do you do on the weekend? You go to a shopping center because it's the only space where you can kind of bear the heat. In this case, it's an outdoor space, it's a public space, it's a community space, and we worked with engineers from Transolar very hard on creating what they call a soft conditioned space. So it's not an air conditioned space, but it works with various cooling strategies to bring the temperature down to acceptable levels throughout the year. And at night, when it's cooler, and in winter when it's cooler, you can just fold up these umbrellas. Then you can see the stars and get fresh air through and participate in nature again. And that is beautiful when you're in the center of a city and you can see the sky. And again, the lighting concept is that at night it becomes kind of an interactive plaza where people can walk through with their iPhones and smartphones and smart devices and interact with lighting and learn about sustainability as you go. I won't go into greater detail for the sustainable strategy. And here are some shots of the buildings that we did go into, but it never actually got to that stage. This is the university in Masdar City by Norman Foster. This is the first part, essentially, of the city that was built. This is the podium where the magnetic cars roam around. And so it is a living laboratory. You can visit it. People do visit it. You can measure temperature. You can measure energy. And the project has been slowed down substantially for the same reason as previous projects with the financial crisis. But I'm still hopeful that it's one of the projects that is really exciting and interesting and important, I think, for the world to follow through. And it was probably never a good idea to build an entire city in 5 years, and if they build it in 25 years, it's probably still a good effort. At the opening, at the Cityscape exhibition, the Sheikh said, one day all cities will be like this. And we kind of believe, obviously not every city will be like this, but if the aspiration is that cities around the world can really learn from the learnings of this experiment, then I think that's really an interesting thing. And if you've been to Beijing and Shanghai and Manila and these cities that are very polluted, very congested, then obviously they are the cities where you could apply some of this wisdom. So since then, and these are just a few last slides, we've been working on a number of schemes that kind of try to interpret similar ideas about urbanism, about nature and technology and creating new environments. And some are on very big scale. This is our entry for the Expo 2017 in Kazakhstan. And this is residential development in Xi'an in China. And a lot of these projects don't necessarily get built, but each of the projects for us is one step further into the research of what is possible and how we can develop architecture in the future. This is one of the most recent ones, but it's also kind of feels a little bit like back in 2007, pre-crisis, where a company in China, they're appropriately named Evergrande, in Chinese Hengda, so very, very big. They're planning this island, which is very, very big. It's a couple of 100 hotels, shopping centers, train stations, aquariums, golf courses, etc., etc. And so we're part of this master plan. They invited, I don't know, a dozen of architects to design all these different pieces. This is our project here, the seven-star hotel, and a couple of UN Studio and Coop Himmelblau and other buildings. So I don't know if this will ever happen, but we hope that some of these projects will come through. In the meantime, we have built some works, not as many as I was hoping when we started out. Some on very different scale, you know, from a chair to a lamp that we did for wallpaper for the furniture show. This is actually in Milano at the Rinascente, you know, the shopping center, Piazza del Duomo. They commission different architects every year for their Christmas decoration, for their windows. This is a fashion show for Maya. The big, do you have Maya here? Yeah. No, it's an Australian biggest retailer. This is a pavilion project. Some of these stretch things. This is an art gallery in Sydney and Paddington. The Martian Embassy I've shown. This is more an art project than an architecture project. It was 2010, the year of the tiger. We designed these two larger-than-life sculptures in front of a public building that subsequently traveled around the world. They were very lightweight, fitted into containers, so they went to San Francisco, to Berlin, to Singapore, and they're currently, I think, in Amsterdam. Recently, we built this space here, which most people say it looks like a rendering, but I don't know why that is. I think it's just because it's built exactly like the rendering. We didn't render the fire exit sign, but this is a display suite for large residential development, a company called Greenland, and it was essentially a square box that we had to transform, and we transformed it into continuous, sinuous space, kind of flow, where the ceiling becomes the floor, floor becomes the ceiling, with these lighting islands and free-flowing elements. This timber-clad wall, lots of LED lights. And another little project just in this series of build projects. This was a 3D model for an ice rink in China, in Haikou, Hainan Island. And so we were only commissioned to do the facade, and we did a 3D model and a few lead details, sent them to China. And then these project pictures came through where they were actually building the building. And this is the most recent picture. So it's now completed. It's kind of a new way of doing architecture where you're not involved into construction, into meetings, into costing. You just do the design and they build it themselves. And I have to say they have done an amazing job considering that we weren't that involved. But yeah, so the world is changing, and I'm not saying that this is the future, that you only do facade design, but it's part of the job maybe. This is a solar refueling station for electric cars in Germany, in Munich. This is the new Philips headquarter in Eindhoven, in Holland. And this is a project for the Sydney airport, which I just walked through today. They're rebuilding the entire duty-free shop, and Graft has done a couple of duty-free shops with the same client. And so that's a very exciting project that I'm looking forward to. And a youth hostel in Bavaria, which is under construction. And what else? You were mentioning the Saudi project. This is a project for a laboratory near Riyadh. And it has a very thick facade, again for insulation and for heat. It has very small openings to keep the sun out. And I didn't think that they were ever going to build it, but they have, and it's now nearing completion. This is the KAXT University Master Plan. Yeah, this is, I think, last 3 slides, which is an entire university master plan based on similar principles as Master City, but a little bit smaller. And we're currently doing documentation for this headquarters.